What is happening, my good people? Thank you for tuning in to another edition of the vlog. Yes, this one comes with a lot of pain, a lot of scars, and just complete disgust. Yeah, I don't even know. My hair? Listen, my hair, whether it's messy or not, doesn't matter, because when I think back on the 2023 New York Mets, it's probably the way my hair is, or the way I feel inside, or the way I've been feeling pretty much for the last almost 4 decades. Empty, sad, bitter, disappointed, disgusted, frustrated, aggravated. Shall I continue? This was a season that a lot of Met fans were banking on as maybe even taking the next step to finally ending this 36-year drought of not winning a World Series, considering last year under Buck Showalter, a former Yankee manager, I might add, and not that it was anything personal because I was all for Buck coming on board, but for a team that won 101 games and a team that had the second best season in the franchise's history, and how they blew it in that final weekend in Atlanta, getting swept where all they needed to do was win one game. One. And what happened? Max Scherzer, Jacob deGrom, Chris Bassett couldn't deliver. So therefore, I had to suffer through a couple of days to get to a wild card round where they hosted against the San Diego Padres, and we all know what happened after that. All right, Max Scherzer got booed off the mound, was atrocious. Thankfully, he got traded there in August, and I'll get to that a little bit later on. But for them to win the second game behind Jacob deGrom, who wasn't great in the game, he did gut it out, and then game 3 was just a disaster. Joe Musgrove. I understand he's a major league pitcher. I get it that he threw a no-hitter earlier that year in Texas. I think it was earlier that year. And here he was in a pressure situation, having to get the Padres into the divisional series. And what does he do? He throws a one-hitter. One hit! The New York Mets couldn't come up with anything more than just one measly hit. And therefore, their hopes, dreams, aspirations of winning a World Series in 2022 went up in smoke. So therefore, we had to look forward to 2023. And what happened? 2023 was quite the opposite. In fact, when you think about what happened in the offseason, where Jacob deGrom left, and I was all for, go back and check those receipts on the podcast, and then bringing in a guy like Justin Verlander, and bringing in players where we thought were going to be key cogs and pieces into maybe, somehow, some way, the Mets getting into October, making a run, and maybe even getting to a World Series, and let alone winning it. But obviously, that was far from the case. So here it was. They come into this year with all of the expectations abound. They get off to a pretty good start. They were actually 14-7 to start off the year, even with a sweep in Detroit. No, the Mets didn't sweep the Tigers. The Tigers swept them. And we know how bad the Tigers have been. So for the Mets to even have a good start, it's not as if the season started off 5-10, and then they got to 500, and then they took a couple steps back, and then by the time June hits, which has been just a demon, just a month that the Met fan, they wish we could just go from May 31st to July 1st, because over the last half decade plus, it has literally been a nightmare of a month for the Mets, their fans, and pretty much their recent history. And for them to not even able to get out of June into July with them hovering around 500 and them on the fringe of any type of wild card before you even get to the All-Star break. And as it was, they started pairing off players at that time. Eduardo Escobar, out. Then later on, we get to July, we have the big guys, whether it was Max Scherzer, who I did not shed a tear for when he left, because based on that performance in the wild card game, as well as what happened in Atlanta, good riddance to you, my guy. But I was surprised about Justin Verlander, because I'm thinking, who's going to start for you next year, opening day, whether it's on the road or at home? In fact, it's going to be at home. I should have known that against the Milwaukee Brewers. You're not going to have a guy that's going to go out there where you know that's going to be a horse, a guy that you're going to rally around, where the curtain's going to be raised in 2024, where we could rally our arms around a guy that we know is proven, is solid, is going to be a Hall of Famer. Instead, it may be Kodai Senga. No offense, because Senga's had a very good year, but for them to trade Verlander, I was very surprised by that. But I digress. With all that being said, and a Met team that's, with the season having been finished yet, they may not even win 74 games. because as I'm recording this, it's the final Saturday of the regular season. So who knows where they end up? They may end up at the current number where they're at now. They may end up winning 3 games as they have to play a doubleheader with the Phillies today, 1 tomorrow, and even a makeup game, or I should say a makeup of a suspended game with the Marlins there on Thursday night, which is just a microcosm of how bad the Mets are. Let me not even go there. So when we add all this up to this 2023 season, and even to piggyback on what happened last year, is this the worst team money can buy 2.0? So let me give you a little bit of a history lesson. 31 years ago, the Mets brought on some players to their team after the run that they had in the 80s and even the 90-91 season, to where they brought in the likes of Eddie Murray, Vince Coleman the year before, the old St. Louis Cardinal left fielder, Brett Saberhagen. They already brought in Bobby Bonilla. So this was the team that a lot of people thought that the Mets would try to get themselves back to the halcyon days of the 80s, where they only won 1 World Series, but they were competitive. They won an average of 96, 97 games a year, and looked like they could possibly be on the trajectory on their way up to at least being respectable and maybe even reputable, to the point where they could be a National League powerhouse. And as we all know, that was far from the truth. We could talk about Vince Coleman, the firecracker. I believe that was in LA as they were leaving Dodger Stadium. Brett Saberhagen with the bleach, spraying it toward the media for whatever the reason. I don't know what possessed him to do that. Bobby Bonilla going up to one of the reporters saying, "I'll show you the Bronx and you cannot wipe the smile off my face." Boy, that was an ugly time in Met history. And to think, that was 92, where the book came out, The Worst Team Money Could Buy, by Bob Klapisch and John Harper, 2 New York sports writers that were on the beat and certainly had their fingers on the pulse of this Met team that was suspected to do a lot and certainly didn't do anything but. And here it was, having to suffer through a season that there was 72 and 90 31 years ago, and then 3 decades, exactly, precisely, 1993, when it just bottomed out. The team went 59 and 103. And people thought they were the laughingstock, not only just in baseball, but in all sports, because they had all these players on the team, all-stars, future Hall of Famers. Eddie Murray was on the team, and he actually produced that year. I believe he hit 27 homers and 100 RBIs in 93. But for whatever the reason, they were awful. They were the bottom of the barrel, the lowest of the lows, and having to endure and suffer as a Met fan at that time, it was almost as if, why do I continue to root for this team? Fast forward 30 years later, with a $345 million payroll and Steve Cohen's big-time bucks from his hedge funds and Wall Street, etc., he thought, let me be a little Steinbrenner-esque and start throwing my money and weight around to the point where I don't care what the payroll is, I don't care what the luxury tax is, I'm going to bring this team a World Series for the first time since 1986. As him being a Met fan growing up in Connecticut, or Long Island, I should say, it's a thing where we thought as Met fans, finally, the Wilpons are gone. In comes Steve Cohen with all of his money and his bluster and bravado. Let's bring that championship back to Flushing for the first time in almost 4 decades. And of course, we're going to have to suffer and wait another year. Because this team, with all the players that they traded there at the deadline, the Mark Cannas of the world, and I understand these are spare parts, Tommy Pham, who later on came out and said that the team didn't have the work ethic that it should. Even guys like Francisco Lindor, a guy who's going to be here for another 8 years, said that, yeah, I could have worked a little bit harder in order to maybe even play better. Seriously? Frankie, is that what you're going to say? I get it. That kernel of truth that you came out, we like that. We want to make sure that you're a guy that is in tune and is focused and does share with the media and with the fans that, hey, maybe I need to get a little kick in the ass in order for me to play better, and maybe spread that throughout the course of the locker room, the players, maybe even the training staff, who knows? But for him to even admit that was just a micro of the macro to how this season had unfolded. And then you have this stuff about Pete Alonso. Maybe he's not the guy that the Mets will want to keep long term, which would be a huge mistake, but I'll get into that on the podcast and maybe somewhere down the road in another vlog. But is this the worst team money can buy 2.0, considering the expectations, the $345 million payroll, pretty much dwarfing the Yankees? Think about that, dwarfing the Yankees when it comes to payroll. Not to say that the Yankee payroll is $80 million, but that had to be, what, almost $100 million more than what the Yankee payroll, or at least $70 million more, you would think. But here it is, another lost season. Just another disaster as a Met fan. Embarrassed, but I'm still gonna rock my blue and orange until the day I die. That's why the podcast colors are blue and orange. Not just because they are the state's colors overall, but of course the Mets and my beloved New York Islanders. Can they do something this year? But for this team that came in with just everything, banking on hopefully a World Series run that we could never ever even imagine, was just a vastly overrated, highly underachieving team that goes down in the annals in Mets history as one of the worst ever. Is it the worst team money can buy 2.0? Maybe, because the cast of characters that were on that Met team 30 years ago can't even compare to this Met team now. In fact, they're choir boys compared to that 93 team. But with all the promise and all the hope and the aspirations that us Met fans had to think that this time, right now, that they could have been either still in the hunt or maybe have clinched a playoff berth, that we could have had the town to ourselves, considering the Yankees are nowhere to be found when it comes to the playoff picture in 2023, that all we have to do is just wonder what could have been, what happened, and what's going to happen in the future as far as this team, knowing that they may not compete next year, that Buck Showalter may not even be back, that we could be looking at a team of a lot of young players that are looking to build for the future, which I'm all for. But to think, not even 2 years ago, I had World Series. Could you imagine visioning a possible World Series trip over these last 2 years? And all I get, just like I've gotten for the previous 37 years, was nothing but disappointment, heartache, pain, suffering, etc. This is the life of a Met fan. And sadly, I wouldn't want to have it any other way. Oh, and if there's one silver lining, David Stearns, the new VP of baseball operations, who is from Flushing and grew up as a Met fan, when the season's over, let's get cracking, my guy. You're on the clock. Let's go.